taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. So there was this little girl who walked into a pet shop and asked, "Excuse me, do you have any rabbits here?" And the clerk says, "Yes, we do." And then leaning down to her level asked, "Did you want a white rabbit, or would you rather have a soft, fuzzy black rabbit?" And the little girl shrugged and said, "I don't think my python really cares." So we are in Ecclesiastes, and I thought that little joke was kind of appropriate because of the word that is the most common word in that book of Ecclesiastes, which is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And that little story right there kind of shows that for a lot of things in life, it doesn't really matter because life is short and then you get eaten by a snake. So I don't know how that works, but that's the Ecclesiastes. It's kind of a pessimistic book. It's basically looking at life and saying, let's face it, lots of things happen, and then they don't happen, and then you grow old, and then you die. So what are you going to do? Yes, I know. I've been trying to come up with ways to say that with a smile, but it doesn't really change the tone of the voice. I mean, you can't really do it. But the reality is, though, is that the second key word is the phrase, under the sun. Everything is meaningless under the sun, on this earth. And when you leave out all of if you leave out God, if you leave out the spiritual things, if you just think about the physical, natural world, it really is like this little story, eat or be eaten, one or the other. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's just like that. And so that's what the world tends to think like this. And as we look through this book, then, we are going to be following the thoughts of the wise man who was the teacher. And the teacher is probably Solomon, or somebody who was writing as Solomon. But Solomon exemplifies the life of somebody who, if you follow the things of this world to their natural conclusion, this is where you end up. And in the way that he writes these things, in the way we read it, we tend to go through it fairly slowly, so we don't get to the punchline a lot of times until down the road a little ways. And so, as we talk about these things, then we're going to have those Sundays when we're going to be talking here, and we're going to be at that point where we're going to say, well, wow, this is just not very exciting. It's a very philosophical book. Last week we did the introduction and basically came up with everything is meaningless. And the good news is that's just the introduction. The bad news is it's only the introduction. And so in verse 12, we get kind of a restart. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12, it's like he starts over again. Verse 1, he says almost exactly the same thing. But in verse 12, it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And then it says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. That's the new phrase for today. Last week it was meaningless under the sun. Today he adds a just in case you didn't get enough from the word meaningless, we're going to add this little phrase just to show you what I mean. It's chasing after the wind. I'm going to give you a bag, and we're all, see, normally this would work, but today, the last couple of days it hasn't, but I would give you a bag, and we'd all go outside, and, I'd give you $1 for everybody who could catch the wind. Get some wind in the bag, right? You just run out there, and it really doesn't work. You chase after the wind, or another way of looking at it is grasping after the wind, trying to hold on to it. You walk out there and the wind blows, and you try to get a big armful of it, and you just can't do it. And that's what he's added that little thought to the idea of meaningless. Not only is there not a lot of purpose here, but you can't really grasp it. You can't understand it. You can't get your hands around it. And it's a heavy burden, he says, on mankind. And mankind means us, people. A heavy burden that God, and he says God has put it there. Last Wednesday night, we had a good discussion on Ecclesiastes. So if you have lots of questions, you should come out on Wednesday and ask those questions. We don't really have any answers, but we do have fun asking the questions. And that was one of the things that we talked about, was the idea that, a lot of times we think of God, and I know that I do this too, and we only think of God as being there in the good things. The good things come from God. The good things come from God. But Solomon here, and the writer of Ecclesiastes, is going to talk about this in depth and say, well, really everything comes from God. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. It doesn't matter if it's hard or easy. It doesn't matter if it blesses us or causes us some problems. The point is, everything comes from God. And that's what he says here, this heavy burden God has put on mankind. And as he goes through the rest of the book, we're going to kind of keep unpacking that. Well, what is this burden that God puts on us? What is it that causes life to be meaningless? I don't want to jump ahead and get to that stuff without going through all the process that he did. As he says here, he says, I applied my mind to wisdom. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that has been done under the heavens. Here he doesn't use under the sun, he uses under the heavens, but it's the same kind of a phrase. It means the same thing. And he says, I have seen all these things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless. Now, we could say, well, yeah, really, he's seen everything? Probably not right. Well, what I want to do is look real quickly back to 1 Kings chapter 4, and we're going to be looking at some of the things that are characteristics of Solomon. There we go. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29 is a description of what God gave. Remember, he just said, in Ecclesiastes, Solomon just said, God has put a heavy burden on all people. And then now, let's see what else God has given Solomon. In Kings 4:29, it says, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite. Wow, he was smarter than Ethan the Ezrahite? Who's Ethan the Ezrahite? Don't know, but somebody at the time that was considered very wise. Not only was he wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. Wow, that's pretty smart, isn't it? Who are those guys? They're pretty smart, though. Solomon is wiser than everybody at the time that he's writing about. And he even brings up these names and says he was wiser even than them. Now, we don't know exactly how wise they were, but the point is, Solomon is the wisest guy. He is a wise guy. That doesn't mean it's a little bit different, but he is the wisest guy out there. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of this wisdom. And this wisdom isn't just spiritual things. This wisdom has natural applications. He's studied plants. He studied animals. He studied the ways of the world, the ways of nature. And so the indication here is, and that last part probably implies political things. So Solomon is wise in all kinds of different ways. Now, we do have to stop for a second and say this. When God talks about wisdom in people like Solomon, he isn't necessarily saying that he's really has a lot of information and is a really smart person like a scientist. Wisdom biblically, and the kind of wisdom that God gives, is always related to the ability to make good moral choices. So when God says to Solomon, here's this wisdom, he's giving Solomon the tools he needs to make the best choices in life. We need to keep that in mind as we're going through Ecclesiastes. This is the guy that we're talking about. This is the guy that applied his mind to wisdom. And two things, well, not two things, but a little thing on the aside here is, a lot of times we think of gifts from God as being something that, just sort of shows up. If I have the gift of preaching, then I can just sort of preach without any kind of work on my part. I just kind of stand up here and just do it, and God gives me this gift, and it just sort of magically happens. But you can see from Ecclesiastes that even though Solomon has this gift, he also applied it to himself. He worked at it. He studied. He did things to make himself more wise, and God gave him the ability to do that. And so it's him doing the things that God has given him to do. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about these things. So he's the wisest guy that ever lived. He's smart. He has all kinds of breadth of knowledge. Not only that, but it's knowledge that can be applied to life in a godly way. And so we have this picture of Solomon then, right? Then we turn over a couple of chapters to 1 Kings chapter 10. In verse 14, we're looking at verse 14 and 15, it says, the weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. Now you're saying, wow, 666 talents, that sounds like a lot. It is a lot. If you do the math, it's approximately 25 tons. 25 tons of gold every year. But that doesn't include the taxes and the tariffs of the things of the government, so it gets more than that. So what are you going to do with 25 tons of gold every year? You can't hardly, just about the time you're done spending last year's 25 tons, you get another 25 tons. The problems that rich people face is just horrible, isn't it? But that's just a huge amount of gold. And what we see then is, not only is Solomon the wisest person and very, he has the characteristic to be able to study what he's going to study, the meaninglessness of life, but he also has the financial resources to do it. He's got more money, he knows what to do with. So he can, whatever he says, I'm going to go do this, he can do it to the utmost. He can do it as far as he needs to go because he's got the resources to do it. Not only is he smart enough to wrestle with these things, he's also got the financial reserves to be able to deal with all of the things that are coming up. So when Solomon says, I tried something, we can be sure that he tried it to the utmost. Financially, in his mind and his thinking, and all of those kinds of things. So when we talk about, so we go back to Ecclesiastes, and we look at verse 1, or the verse we read in verse 13, actually, it says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom. So when he applied himself to it, when he explored this, he went overboard. He went down that road further than any of us could ever go, because he could. He had the time, he had the money, he had the brains, he had everything you can think of. And then, after he says, I applied this, he says, what a heavy burden. you get the first inkling of what that burden is. In Ecclesiastes 1, verse 15, right after he says, it's all of them are meaningless, chasing after the wind, he gives a proverb. In verse 15, that is, what is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. And that's perfectly obvious what he's talking about there. So we're just going to go right on to the next thing, because that's just it's a proverb. So he's saying something wise, because this is Solomon, and he has tested out all these things, and he's come to this conclusion. If it's crooked, you can't straighten it. If you don't have it, you can't count it. On one hand, you say, well, okay, that makes some sense. But what is he trying to say? Let's connect this then to the previous verse where he said, God has put a heavy burden on us. Okay, well, what's that burden? Here's the lesson we get from this proverb. Lesson number 1 is, since we cannot change what God is or is not doing, all our activities under the sun are chasing the wind. If God has made something crooked, we can't straighten it out. If God insists that's the way it's going to be, then that's the way it's going to be. If God isn't going to do something, we're not going to be able to make him do it. So when we look at our lives and we start thinking about, well, if I have this, I have a family member or I have a friend, and if I could just say the right word, then they would come to Christ. Or if I could just say the right thing, they would fix their lives. See, we think we can fix what's crooked. And Solomon says that's one of the problems with life is you can't fix what's crooked. If that has happened, and God is doing it, and God does everything, then whatever's going to happen is happening. And that's a burden on us. Because, well, many of us, we want to be able to go to somebody who's going down the wrong path, and we want to grab them by the shoulders and just shake them real hard and say, no, get over there where you're supposed to. And Solomon, being the wisest man around, has this problem more than the rest of us do. Why? Because he sees more clearly what's going on in lives of the people around him. Because God has given him this gift of wisdom. And Solomon says, but you know what? I can't fix what's crooked. Only God can do that. And if they're going down that path, and that's the path God has laid out for them, then that's a heavy burden. And it's one of the reasons why we say, well, maybe there's this meaning, maybe chasing after the wind is what Solomon is talking about here. I would really like to be able to fix the problems of this world. If people would just listen to me, we would get this fixed. And then I realize God's the one who's in control, not me. If I try to fix everything, I'm chasing the wind. I'm trying to get a hold of something that I can't get a hold of. And then the second part of there about what is lacking cannot be counted. One of the problems that we have is that we really can't see what is not there. That's kind of hurts your head a little bit to think about that for a minute. But when you start trying to figure out, well, there's something missing here. And usually when you say that to yourself, you know what? You never really remember or figure out what's missing. Because you can't count that. You don't know what could have been or what might have been. Right? We have that in our life. You know, go back 10 years, and if I had just done this instead of that, then all this stuff would have happened. Well, we don't know that. You don't know what would have happened or not happened if you had done something differently. And again, it's kind of grasping the wind. We think about and worry about all this stuff that we can't do anything about. But we want to. And that's why Solomon says, there's this heavy burden laid on mankind. Is that you have to live your life. And even though you're smarter than everybody else, and you have more money than everybody else, and you're the king, you can't fix everybody. You can't straighten what's crooked. You can't fix what's lacking. It just doesn't work. You can't. So you're chasing after the wind. Aren't you just overjoyed to be in church today? But as part of what we have to do is we have to accept the fact that we can't do it. that we can't fix the problem. I can't solve the problem. Only God can. The only thing I have any control over at all is my own thinking, my own life. That's it. I don't have any control over anything the rest of you do. I can stand up here and I can preach and preach and preach and preach and preach, and whether you do it or not, or whether you believe it or not, I can't twist your arm and make you do it. I can give you reasons, I can talk you through it, but you're either going to do it or you're not going to do it, and I don't get to decide that. Like, I say that to myself a lot. You know, God is God, and I'm not. And we just have to keep reminding ourselves. And Solomon has to learn that lesson up front, or he's basically saying, at the end of all of the things that I'm going to do, and I'm going to tell you about, this is really the result of the matter. I can think these things through, I've got all this wisdom, but at the end of the day, it is what it is, and I'm just going to go watch the baseball game. But chasing after the wind, that's what this is, chasing after the wind. So then, in verse 16, though, he's not quite satisfied with that answer, I don't think. So in verse 16, he says, I said to myself, look, I haven't, isn't that what he's talking to himself? Yeah. Do you ever do that?
Yeah.
I do it all the time. Yeah. Bugs Carol crazy because I'm talking to myself and she thinks I'm talking to her, and I'm not. I'm talking to myself. I'm the only one who really understands what I'm talking about. So that's why I talk to myself. So Solomon says, I said to myself, and by the way, as we go through, verse 16. I said to myself, he's going to say it again in chapter 2, verse 1. But from here on out, for the next few chapters, notice how many times the word I appears. I said to myself. I didn't say to somebody else. It's I, myself, me. It's all self-centered. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. Not only am I smarter than Ethan and Hammond and Cal, all those guys, but I'm smarter than people in the past, too. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Not only has he studied, but he says, experienced it. In other words, I've used wisdom and knowledge, and it's either worked or not worked, depending upon the situation. And so I've experienced it. It said, verse 17, it says, then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom, and also of madness and folly. He didn't just follow the path of wisdom. At some point he thought, well, maybe what I should do is just do the opposite. Maybe instead of being the wisest person, maybe I should be the foolish person and go crazy a little bit. He says, and I tried that too. Interesting thing. He didn't just apply the wisdom. He was thinking, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe wisdom isn't the best way, so let's try the other way. If I think this is the wise thing to do, I'll just do the opposite. Now, we probably know people like that actually in our lives who do that. Maybe not even on purpose, but it seems like, well, they know the right way to go, but that doesn't seem right, so they do the opposite, and then it turns out badly. But I learned that this, too, is a chasing after the wind. The folly and the madness doesn't work either. That's what he says. Whether you follow the path of the wise or you follow the path of the fool, they're both chasing after the wind. Because of God, but also in verse 18 is another proverb. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Because you look at it, goes back to the thing about God and trying to trust God to take care of things, and you can't control that, and you can't make it. He says, but I see the problems. The more wisdom you have, the more knowledge you have, the more you see the problems, the more grief there is. The more problems, because you see the problems. You see the issues. You see the destruction. You see the problems in somebody's life. And you can't do anything about it. So it creates more grief, more sorrow in your life, in our lives. Sometimes it's better just to not know, right? You hear that all the time. No, don't tell me. I don't want to know, because if I know, it'll just make it harder for me. So just go do what you're going to do, and we'll clean up the mess later. The old saying about ignorance is bliss. If you don't know, then it doesn't bother you. Right now, whatever's going on in, pick a country, Pakistan, I don't know what's going on there, so it doesn't bother me. And if I knew, it might bother me, or it might not. So sometimes, if you're having a problem in your life, I'm encouraging you to call, and we'll talk about it, and I'll try to help you. But if you're not going to listen to what I say, then just don't call me. Because it's just going to create, I think this is where Solomon gets into the I problems and myself, is because if you tell me your problems, now I know about your problems, and it's going to cause me problems. So I don't want to hear your problems unless we're going to work on those problems together and try to help you. But if you're not going to do it, then don't tell me, because it's just going to be a problem for me. Right? That's what Solomon is saying with this last little proverb or parable. Much wisdom comes much sorrow, more knowledge, more grief. He is the wisest man in the world. He's got all the money in the world. He's going to chase down all these problems, and he's going to try to fix the world, and then he can't fix the world, so just go cry in my room. Go cry in my coffee. It's going to just cause problems. See, this is where Solomon is looking at the world, and he's studying all these things, and he's debating all this stuff, and he's looking at all the issues, and it's all meaningless and chasing the wind because I can't change anything anyway, and it's just causing me more grief. That's the lesson number 2. Since we cannot understand God's ways, all our choices made under the sun are chasing the wind. So we make choices to try to help people, and it just, and sometimes you get some successes and things work, but a lot of people just don't want to hear. They just don't want to do it. They don't want to follow the right path. And I know the right path, so you should listen to me. Relatively speaking, yeah. And that's what Solomon says. God's given me all this stuff, and I want to tell people, and I want to teach people, and nobody's listening. Well, some people. I mean, that's part of it is that you got to stop for a second and go, there are some people listening. There are some lives that have changed. I mean, there is some out there. But when you look at the big picture, it's all chasing the wind. Good. Got all that. We're going to get into the there was a story. It's happened over 100 years ago. The guy's name was Bobby Leach. I don't think anybody here knows him because nobody here was alive 100 years ago. But anyway, back in 1911, a stuntman named Bobby Leach went over Niagara Falls in a specially designed steel drum. And he lived to tell about it. Although he suffered minor injuries, he survived because he recognized the tremendous dangers involved in the feat, and he had done everything he could to protect himself from harm. A few years later, he was walking down a street, and he slipped on an orange peel, fell, and broke his leg. He was taken to a hospital where he died of complications from that broken leg. He went over Niagara Falls in a barrel and hardly any injuries. Then he slips in the street and he dies from. See, when you see stuff like that, now you know how Solomon feels. It doesn't make any sense. How can those kind of things happen? You take these huge risks, nothing happens, then you're just minding your own business, and boom, your life's over. You know what it is? It's meaningless. That's what it is. It's chasing after the wind. That's what it is. And that's what Solomon is trying to get across to us. When we look at life, we realize just how random it is and how these things just don't. I mean, if life was really fair and really had meaning, then the people who made bad choices would always suffer the consequences. The people who make good choices would always. But that's just not the way it works. Sorry, but it doesn't. It does sometimes, but not all the time. There's no guarantees. So, chapter 2, verse 1. again, Solomon says, I said to myself. He's still talking to himself, so we keep that going. Come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? So if life is all meaningless, let's just have a good time. Let's just tell jokes. Let's laugh. Let's do only the things that feel good. Anything that will make me feel good, let's do that, because that will bring meaning to life, right? And he says, no. I hired all the best comedians, and they told all the best jokes, even used some of the jokes from Pastor Russ's files, but still, it was all meaningless at the end of the day. The pleasure, just doing things to feel good, isn't the way to go. In verse 3, he says, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. So we'll stop for a second. Folly is making bad moral choices. It's the opposite of wisdom. So he says, I'm going to go down that path of folly. I'm just going to drink myself drunk. Maybe that will bring us the meaning of life. And it's interesting because he says, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. And then he says, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. So there's something going on here where he says, even though he's going down this path of drinking, there's in the back of his mind, there's still some control of this. This is an experiment. This is something that I'm doing just for... Now, if you go to an AA meeting or you talk to people who are addicted, that's the kind of thinking that gets you into trouble. Because you think you're still in control when you actually aren't. And so there could be something going on here that Solomon is showing us that if you go down a path like this, you need to stop and realize that you're not really, you may think you're in control, but you're not. The alcohol or the drugs or whatever it is you're addicted to, that's where the control is, and you've lost it. But there could be a situation here where Solomon is able to do this in some way. He's able to go down this road of addictions or using wine and alcohol, but still in the back of his mind, there's some kind of control here. He's able to do this as a test. That's the picture that's going on. And then he says, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens or under the sun during the few days of their lives. Maybe the best way is just to be drunk all the time. Maybe that's just the best way to do it. It's not going to necessarily bring meaning to your life, but maybe you just won't care if you have meaning or not. Which is partly the reason why, or at least some people, follow this path. They drink or take drugs to deal with the meaninglessness of their life. And that's the way they go. And Solomon's conclusion is, it's not any better. It doesn't change anything. I remember hearing one person say about their life was that they would look into their refrigerator and they would see just a can of beer and a tomato in there. And so they'd go get drunk or go on a high for a week and they'd come back and their beer would be gone and now it's a moldy tomato. It didn't change anything, right? It just spent some time doing some things. I mean, it brings about the meaninglessness of life. So his first experiment is with pleasure. Laughter, drinking, partying, all this stuff. And so the experiment number one, the conclusion is, we will not find meaning under the sun, even if we only do things that bring us pleasure. Even if we only do things that bring pleasure, there's not going to be meaning. It's not going to change anything. The realities of our life are still the same. So he's going to change tactics. Okay, try pleasure, try partying all the time, try doing everything just to make myself feel good. I tried all of that, didn't work. So, and in verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. Notice again, he built houses for himself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Took on the building projects, made houses for himself, made a house for God. Solomon's temple is what was at the time one of the 7 wonders of the world. So when he says he took on projects, he took on projects. By the way, it took him 7 years to build the temple. It took him 13 years to build his own house. I don't know what that means exactly. You can read into that whatever you want. But so for 20 years, he was working on the temple and the palace for himself. But it says here also houses and built houses plural. So he was building houses he had 700 wives, so that's a lot of houses that he needs to build. So he was spending a lot of time. So he throws himself into his work, right? He just invests all this time. He's an architect, he's designing the houses, and then he's the foreman on the job, and he's making sure everybody's doing things right. He's building. This is one of this little Bible kind of, when you're reading the Bible and you read things about, notice he mentions gardens, and he talks about trees, and then he talks about watering the trees. That description is very similar to the description of God building the Garden of Eden. The garden, he built a garden with trees in it, and he made sure there was plenty of water. And so there's this echo here. Whenever you see something like this where you have somebody building a garden or building and watering it and taking care of it, it's almost like Solomon says, well, I can't really straighten what's crooked, but I could maybe build something like God did. And so he's starting to get into this little bit of, I'm so smart, I have all this money, maybe I can do these things like God did. Maybe I can be like God. And he's going to learn that that's not going to work either. But there's that little echo in there. Just like I said, whenever you're reading the Bible and somebody's talking about trees and gardens and watering it and designing it, think back to the creation and think back to the Garden of Eden and think about what happened after that and what happens to Solomon. In verse 7, he goes on and says, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. The first part about the slaves it's part of the thing that happens in the Old Testament. The slaves and then the herds just demonstrate his riches. That's what it demonstrates. I own all this stuff. Not only am I building stuff, but I can put slaves in every one of those houses. I have herds and I have flocks and I have all kinds of animals under my control. I have all this stuff I've accumulated. So not only am I building things, but my bank account's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we know people like that in our time who, at this point in their life, at 50 years old, not about this point, but at 50 years old, they have more money than they know what to do with it. A lot of them try to give it away, and they can't even do it that fast enough sometimes. And that's Solomon. I've tried building things. I've tried accumulating, amassing things, so I'm building a fortune. And all of this stuff is going on, and I'm getting more richer and more powerful and stronger, and I'm getting smarter, and I'm applying myself to wisdom, and it's not really working. Then he says in verse 9, interesting, again, an interesting way of looking at it. It says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And then it says again, in all this, my wisdom stayed with me. So we have to ask ourselves, is he just kidding himself? Is this wisdom really staying with him? And if it is, and if we take that for the truth, then what it means is he was building all these things and he was amassing all this wealth, but he was doing it in the right way. He wasn't cheating people. He wasn't taking advantage of them. he was acting out of the wisdom that God gave him, and he was still growing, and he was still accumulating, and he was still building. And guess what? It's still meaningless. See, that's where we have to make sure that we're tracking with the way he's thinking. Even if you do everything the right way, it still is chasing the wind. It's still meaningless. It still, at the end of the day, doesn't make any difference. Now we're going to see in the coming weeks that one of the reasons why that is because every person, it's 100% certain that every person in this room is going to die. Someday, your life will be over. Might be tomorrow. Maybe you'll be like some people and live to 120. But you know what? There's an end. It will end. And if it ends, one person I knew used to say all the time, you can't put a U-Haul behind the hearse. Because you can't take it with you. It's here. And one of the things that we'll talk about in the few weeks too is Solomon has this son, and his name's Rehoboam. Solomon was the most successful king in Israel's history. He was more successful than David was, even though David is looked at as the greatest king. Solomon he extended the borders the farthest. He had the most money coming in. He had a reign of peace. There were very few wars during his time there. He was the greatest king. When Solomon died, he left all of that to his son Rehoboam. And within, if I remember the number right, it's like 3 months, Rehoboam starts a civil war, the kingdom gets split in half, and everything that Solomon built is destroyed. And Solomon says, see what happens? You can do the right things your whole life, and guess what? Your children then squander it and give it away and cause problems, and what are you going to do? It's just chasing the wind. It's just chasing the wind. So, experiment number 2 with all of the successful things that he did, it says, the conclusion is, we will not find meaning under the sun, even if we are successful in everything we do. It's still meaningless. It's still no meaning under the sun. We all die, and then what? Stand before God. And God's not going to ask you how much money you have. He's going to ask you what you do with it. He's not going to ask you how much stuff did you build. He's going to say, why? God's not going to look at you. God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. He's got the wealth on every mind. God has created this whole world, the universe. There is nothing you can build that's going to impress God. You can't get enough money, regardless of what you think, to have as much money as God has. No, you can't do it. So God doesn't look at you and go, wow, you did pretty good. You got a pretty good number there in your bank account. God's going to say, well, what did you do with it? What was your attitude towards it? And why did you gather all that money? In verse 10, Solomon goes on. This is the kind of the conclusion of all this. I investigated pleasure. I investigated work and labor and building things, and I accumulated all this wealth. I did all this stuff. Then it said, and verse 10 says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. If I wanted it, I got it. If it was out there, I took it. I didn't deny myself anything. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. The reward is that he did well when he built. Once it was built, people would say, hey, that was a really good job. And he'd say, oh, good, and pat himself on the back. But if that's all you're doing, see, there's only meaningless. Verse 11, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. I was thinking about this morning as I was shaving. Sometimes I think when I'm shaving, sometimes I don't. But today I did. And there's the passages in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says to people, if you give all your money and you do it so that people will see you and then praise you, then Jesus says, you have your reward. It's the praise of people. If you pray these big, mighty prayers and people are impressed, but you weren't really talking to God, you have your reward. And that's what Solomon says. I did all of this stuff. People praised me for my wisdom. People said, remember back in Kings, people said, he's the wisest guy ever. He's even wiser than those other guys. He's got more money, and they're praising him for his build. He built one of the 7 wonders of the world. And at the end of the day, Solomon has his reward. What's his reward? That people praised him. If you want, but that's all under the sun. If you want a life that's not meaningless, if you want a life that is not chasing after the wind, then what you have to look for is God's praise. You have to look for the things that God thinks are important. So we want to have a New Testament perspective, because in some ways Ecclesiastes is an Old Testament book, and it doesn't take into account some of the maybe different ways we should look at things. But in Matthew chapter 6, and we already sang this song this morning, so thank you, Tim, for choosing that. But Matthew 6, verse 33 says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek first God's kingdom. Seek first God's approval. Do that. And there's nothing wrong with building great palaces and accumulating money and having a laugh and all of those kinds of things. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you didn't seek first God's kingdom, then all that stuff is going to be meaningless. Why? Because you're chasing those things rather than God. That's what seek means. Seek God first. And then let those other things worry about themselves. I've got a couple of minutes, and I like to do this occasionally, and I don't know if I can do it because some of you are almost asleep, and it's almost lunchtime, and all this stuff. But I just want you to take a second, and if you've got a blank piece of paper there, that would be great. There's some pencils around. I want you to make a list of the things that are important in your life. Okay, now, if you don't have paper or pencil and you just want to think about it in your head, but I'm just going to give you a second to list the things that are important. Put number 1 and what's the most important thing, number 2, what's important, 3, 4, and just make a quick list of all of the things that are important to you. I'm just going to give you like a minute here while I'm talking to do that. Some of you are writing, that's good. Some of you are just staring at me like, no, Pastor, I'm not going to do that. So that's okay. It's a thought experiment. And I like to do this because the way that I do it tends to surprise people, because it's a way of thinking about things that they're not really used to. So, writing a list, thinking about it in your head, what's most important to me, what's the second most, what's the third most, fourth, maybe you only got 2 things that are important to you, that's okay. The idea of what does it mean to seek God's kingdom first? Okay, I'm sorry I didn't give you that much time, and I know, but that's okay. You got an idea. You've been thinking about it for a minute. Okay, so how many of you by number 1 wrote God? Good. That's good. Now, cross it off. If you wrote a list down, cross it off. It's because part of the problem is that a lot of times when we do a list like this, is that we tend to think of God as being, okay, I get up in the morning, I say my prayer, read my Bible, okay, I got that off my list, and now I can go on to the other important things in my life. Instead, take the rest of your list, and next to each one of those things, write plus God. If your job was number 2, okay, but you got to do it with God. If your family is the number with God, or your friends, or whatever it is that your church, kind of surprising to say that, but church with God. Whatever it is that you have on there, the point is you're supposed to do it God's way. You're supposed to do it with God. God is not somebody or something that you get up in the morning and you read your Bible and you check that off your list and then you go about the rest of your day and you don't have to think about God because I already took care of that God. I already took care of God in the morning and I don't have or last night or someplace. But no, it's every minute of every day, walking down the street, whatever you're doing, wherever you're talking to, God is there with you and you are doing things God's way in everything that you do. That's what it means to seek God's kingdom first. Most important. It's just included with everything that you do. And it's not a checklist. In Colossians 3, Paul says it like this. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord God, the Lord Christ, you are serving. See, that's what it appears when Solomon talks in Ecclesiastes about everything's chasing after the wind. It's because he didn't do this. He did everything to bring things to himself. I built palaces. I talked to myself. I did these things. I did these things. I did these things. And he got praise from people, but we need to do things so that we will receive praise from God. And at the end of the day, you won't have to say that it's chasing after the wind. Because, Paul says, your reward is from God. And so you will get that reward. And it will have then, and it will give meaning to everything we do here. Let's pray. Our God, I thank you for the lesson this morning from Solomon. And God, as we go forward, we pray that you would fill our hearts and our minds with your presence so that everywhere we go, every person we meet, everything we do will always be focused on getting our reward from you. And then, Father, we will just give you the glory and the praise and just celebrate your grace and mercy and love for us. And even when we fail, God, even when we start to go down the wrong path, just keep bringing us back to that place and saying, this too, God, I give you the glory, I give you the praise, and ask you to give